Hello, this is Professor Peter Coughlin, once again creating, presenting, recording, and posting video summarizing the quiz on Module 2 from the GE 4016 course. That module was on external analysis. As you know, these videos are intended not only to summarize the overall results, which I've already sort of done in class, but also to go over the particular quiz questions that had proved to be most problematic. In other words, what I will call the challenging quiz questions, the quiz questions that fewer than 4 out of 5 of you got correct. So still questions that in all cases the majority of you got correct. In fact, more than 70% I think in all the cases I'll present. But they proved problematic for at least 1 in 5 students, and so it's worthy of taking time to go over those. So these are the overall distributions statistics from the quiz. I showed you these before. This doesn't include a couple of cases of people who had technical issues and scored zeros on it, but I've actually got I'm adjusting for that. But as you can sort of see, the quizzes submitted ranged in score from 38 to 100. I think I mentioned in class that a fair number of students did score perfect 100 on this quiz, which is encouraging to me. Again, the grade ranges, these are sort of the way I'm grading the course overall. I mentioned that I'm going to use a little more leniency and allow the top 50% of the course, give at least 50% A's in this course, right? And that's also reflected by the fact that, look, if people are scoring a 90 or above, different professors might have their different standards, but if you're scoring 90s and above in my course, I don't care what the distribution is, you've earned yourself an A, right? And so again, so here we have that half of the students scored a 90 or above, and if that continues, certainly then I'm already committing to give the top 50% or more A's in the course, and certainly if students continue to score this well, I might be giving them even more top grades. Now, the purpose of this primarily, though, is to talk about sort of specific questions. And so there were 19 questions on this quiz. It was a pretty short quiz. And for 15 out of those 19 questions, at least 80% of students answered correctly, right? Meaning that for most of these questions were either you got it right or wrong. So you either got full credit or no credit. So this means that for most of these questions we're talking about on the quiz, it means that for 15 out of 19, at least 4 out of 5 students chose the correct answer. Some of the quiz questions were partial credit, though, and so therefore you could conceivably, get, instead of it's not an all or nothing, you could have gotten part of the points. And so I use the same 80% standard, but this time what it reflects is that the average score is, if it's I consider it a challenging quiz question if the average score is below 80% of the total points possible. So again, so 15 out of 19 questions, there was not much difficulty. Students did very well. Some questions every single student answered correctly. But for the following 4 questions, less than 80% did answer correctly. And there was 3 sections in the quiz. There was a section on external analysis in general, there was a section on 5-force analysis, and a section called external analysis beyond the 5 forces. And so, as you can see, there was one question from question number 3 from the external analysis in general section, question number 2 from the 5-force analysis section, and questions 1 and 3 from the external analysis beyond the 5 forces section proved to be problematic. And so we're going to go over those now. And hopefully these answers, most students' concerns will presumably lie within these 4 questions. But if you have concerns about other questions, other 15 that I don't talk about right now, your first recourse, and certainly your speediest recourse, is to talk to your fellow students, because as I said, for the other 15 questions, 4 out of 5 students answered correctly, which means the student to your left and the student to your right probably both got it correct. And they might be able to help you understand the question and the answer and the correct answer and where you got stuck. But if that's not a satisfactory answer again, please do contact me, and at some point at least I will be sure to get back to you and make sure I adjust the score appropriately or explain the question better, etc. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about that first problematic question, which was in the section on external analysis in general. It was question 3 in that section. And this was the question. It said, and I've included most of the preamble here, to it to sort of give a context. So in any external analysis, the specific label or category for a service, product, or organization may vary depending on how you define the boundaries of the market. In an external analysis or from the perspective of the U.S. military branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, etc., uniform military personnel would most appropriately be analyzed as part of which force or industry element, right? So if we were doing an external analysis for the U.S. military branches, right? So in other words, the organizations we're looking at are Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. They are the players within. They are the organizations that are focal firms. To the degree they compete, they would be the competitors or the rivals. Right? But the idea is we're looking from their perspective, looking outside. How would they label or categorize, the uniformed military personnel? What are uniformed military personnel to the armed forces? All right. Well, you may remember this. And I'm going to show you a couple slides and actually an excerpt from the reading to give you an idea of where these answers to these questions can be found. Well, one of them, remember I had a slide that I'm going to just show you part of it here, but we talked about this idea of identification of external players and how we have broad identification. And I remember I talked about the idea of marketing myopia, about the idea that there's a tendency for people to do external analysis and look only at their customers and their competitors. And I talked about how the five forces, said you've got to look not just downstream at customers, but upstream at suppliers. You've also got to expand your definition of competition to include, potential entrants and substitutes. And that five forces sort of expanded what we look at in our external analysis and broadens our identification of the important external players. And then I said, but there have been, at times some, I wouldn't say modifications, but some understanding of what we really mean or expansion of these definitions of these five forces. For example, the issue of customers. Right? Customers can be, the idea is think about, the idea that in many organizations, especially in the public sector, but also in nonprofit, but even in for-profit private sector, right? Think about it, medical providers, right? There's an issue that you actually have two types of customers. You have those who actually use the product or service, right? And those who actually fund it. Right? Obviously, that we see that all the time in government, right? Those for whom the command or organization or entities or individuals for whom you're providing the service aren't necessarily the ones who are actually paying for it. But that's true, of course, for nonprofits. If you think about the Red Cross, you think about Habitat for Humanity, you think about the ASPCA, you think about Make-A-Wish Foundation. Those who are funding their operations are not the same individuals or organizations who are using those services, right? But also, of course, you think about a hospital or in the medical field, right? The idea that patients are obviously those who receive the medical services, but often the primary payers are insurance companies, Medicare, the government, etc. So you've got to sort of expand your definition of customers. Right? The same is true though for suppliers, because one of the ideas, there was a tendency I've seen of some people to think about labor unions as being outside the five forces, about some non-market factor. But no, what is a labor union? A labor union is just a collection of employees, right? It's a collective bargaining unit for your labor, right? Well, and what is labor to any operation, right? Well, in economics, we generically think of as if there's only two inputs, one being capital, and one being labor, right? But we can certainly break down our supply into input suppliers and labor suppliers, right? And so there's raw material inputs or other inputs, whatever it might be. But the key input in many industries, of course, is labor, and that's the key supplier. And so what I gave you this slide, we talked about the five forces. Really, here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 actually bubbles here, but it still is part of the five forces, right? But for our question, remember what we're trying to talk about is the idea of what is what are uniformed military personnel, to the focal organization, which in this case would be maybe the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marines. What are you to the Navy as a Navy employee? Right? Well, let's think about this. Right? And so you already sort of understand that, look, you are labor. You provide your labor. You supply your labor to the Navy. Right? And therefore, you are a labor supplier. You are a supplier. Right? And in particular, here's a quote from the reading you had on the 5 competitive forces that shape strategy. A selection from the section on power of suppliers here's what Porter talks about. His quote, "Powerful suppliers capture more of the value for themselves by charging higher prices, limiting quality of services, or shifting costs to industry participants. Powerful suppliers, including suppliers of labor, can squeeze profitability out of an industry that is unable to pass on cost increases in its own prices. Pilots' unions, for example, exercise considerable supplier power over airlines, partly because there is no good alternative to a well-trained pilot in the cockpit." Right? Now, the punchline that I'm hoping you get out of this selection is that labor is a supplier, right? Employees are suppliers, right? If you get a paycheck, you are a supplier to the person giving you that paycheck, the organization giving you that paycheck, right? And so in this idea, so then what are uniformed military personnel? From the perspective of the Army, Navy, Air Force, what are uniformed military personnel? They are the labor. They're their employees. They are the suppliers, right? They are a supplier, right? And so not a lot of people got to struggle with this. I think something like 78%, whatever, got it correct. But again, it was enough students struggled that I wanted to take some time to talk about this question. All right, well, that was the only question from the external analysis in general section. There was one question that was challenging from the 5-force analysis section. It was question number 2, and it said the following. True or false? Buyer power and supplier power are opposing external forces such that an industry subject to relatively high buyer power will consequently be subject to relatively low supplier power. Okay. Now, this is a question that always seems to students stumble on. Even to the point where if you go back and if you remember my lecture, I explicitly tell you this is a sort of question that's on the quiz. It's a question that always confuses some students. Here's the right answer, here's the wrong answer. And so I actually go through this question almost exactly. I told you what the answer was during class because it always seems to be a sticking point. And notice that even though I did that, it's still a sticking point, right? But so the idea is, again, what it's saying here is, look, that buyer power and supplier power are opposing external forces such that an industry subject to relatively high buyer power will consequently subject to relatively low supplier power. In other words, if you have high buyer power, if you're doing a 5-force analysis and you find that you have high buyer power, then, or the intensity of buyer power is high, the bargaining power of buyers is high, then it must be that the bargaining power of suppliers is low. You have low supplier power. Right? They have to be opposites. You can't have high buyer power with high supplier power, or low buyer power with low supplier power. That's what this question is saying. Is that because they're opposing forces, or that they are opposing forces, and therefore there has to be if one's high, the other one's low. Well, let's look into that. The first thing to understand is, remember, when we're looking at the 5 forces, right? Here is just a diagram of the 5 forces. Sort of this idea that all of them sort of impacting on the industry itself, in which, competitors within the industry, we're talking about rivalry within the industry, but these are all sort of outside the industry. New entrants potentially coming in, substitutes, stealing away customers, or even actually suppliers too, but competition, indirect competition from new entrants or substitutes, coming into the industry, right? But buyers and suppliers are also, they have a relationship with the industry that you're analyzing, right? But understand the idea is we're looking at, for example, buyers from that industry and suppliers to that industry, right? So the idea is, if you think about an organization such as, soft drink bottlers. Well, who buys from soft drink bottlers? Well, the buyers from soft drink bottlers, right, would be like supermarkets, fountains, other places where you could, convenience stores, etc., where you can buy Coke and Pepsi, right? Or Coke and Pepsi products. Who are the suppliers? Right? Well, the suppliers, right? If we're talking about bottlers in here, the suppliers, right, are the primary suppliers, the concentrate producers, but also the packaging suppliers, primarily the concentrate producers. And so when we talk about buyer power, we're talking about, for example, the relationship between, say, supermarkets and bottlers. When we're talking about supplier power, we're talking about the relationship between concentrate producers and bottlers, right? And so understand that when we talk about buyer power, one side of it is the same, right? But we're talking about, the 2 different sort of economic transactions. One in which the organizations have with their suppliers, one in which their bargaining power relative to their buyers, right? And I gave you this depiction, right, where I talked about, look, it's possible that you could have low buyer power, high supplier power, right? So here, low buyer power would mean that basically customers are paying pretty close to their willingness to pay, but because you have high supplier power, that suppliers are receiving, in terms of what the firms pay them in cost, so what the suppliers are receiving is above what their opportunity cost is, right? So this is the value that they get. Suppliers capture a lot of value. That's the essence of having high bargaining power. You could have high buyer power, low supplier power. Here, the buyers are able to have high bargaining power and therefore are able to pay a price well below their true willingness to pay. Whereas suppliers have, here with low supplier power, their suppliers are receiving from the firm, which is the firm's cost, right? Something not much higher than their opportunity cost, right? So they're capturing very little value. Okay? You could have high buyer power and high supplier power, right? Where so much of the value is being captured by suppliers and by buyers, very little left over for the firms in the industry, right? Or you could have low buyer power and low supplier power, right? So the idea that if you think about the idea that the price, is high, very close to buyers' willingness to pay, that reflects low buyer power, and that what firms are paying suppliers, i.e. the firm's cost, is very close to the firm's supplier opportunity cost. The supplier's opportunity cost, so they're not capturing much, and the firm ends up capturing a lot of value, right? When we looked at the concentrate producers, Coke and Pepsi, this was their story on the far right here, right? Their buyers were the bottlers, right? And although they had some bargaining leverage, we know that concentrate prices were going up and up and up, while retail prices were going down and down, which means that the bottlers are getting squeezed, right? And that therefore they had relatively low buyer power for the bottlers, but also the suppliers. Who supplies Coke and Pepsi, right? Well, the suppliers for Coke and Pepsi. What goes into a Coke and Pepsi, right? The labor is not specialized, right? We're not talking about NFL, athletes who are getting millions of dollars or entertainers. The labor is not specialized, nor are the inputs. Right? The inputs are pretty much commodities that go into the concentrate, and so we have a situation of low supplier power and low buyer power. The punchline of all this being that no, they're not mirroring forces in the sense that, you analyze them the same way. But you could have low buyer power with high supplier power, or low buyer power with low supplier power. And the same with, vice versa. You could have high buyer power with low supplier power, high buyer power with high supplier power. Just because one is low does not mean the other will be high, right? Because we're talking about two different negotiations. Two completely different power relationships are being analyzed when you look at buyer power as opposed to supplier power. So, this question, buyer power, true or false, buyer power and supplier power are opposing external forces such that an industry subject to relatively high buyer power will consequently be subject to relatively low supplier power. That statement is false, right? In fact, we gave examples, just in the previous diagram where you could have high buyer power with high supplier power, All right, so then the last two questions that were problematic were in the final section here on external analysis beyond the five forces, and questions 1 and 3. Question 1 was basically saying, what does it mean to be a complement? So here it said. It said, which, if any of the statements A through C below would not imply that company A is a complementer to company B? Right? And we had the different answers, and we're going to go through each one specifically, so I'm not going to read them right now. Right? They're actually, I think the order, I've purposely sort of changed the order. I believe what I have here as answer C came first, and then it was A, then the order was A, then B, then D. But for purposes of teaching, I've changed the order here. But before we even talk about the answers, right? Let's step back and say, what does it mean to be a complementer? What do we mean about complementers, right? Well, remember, our introduction to complementers was both in the classroom, but also in your reading. Right? You had the reading on corporate diplomacy. See, the reading by Michael Watkins. And it introduced this idea of the value net. It talked about the value net, which is a framework developed by Brandenburger and Nailbuff, and it's in their book Co-opetition, but it's also in your reading on the influence game. So here we have the value net, which sort of depicts this idea of, both the flow of products and services and the flow of money. Like, suppliers provide their services or products to the organization, which then provides to the customers, and money flows in the opposite direction. Or competitors, suppliers could choose to supply competitors instead. Also, substitutes or new entrants could also, in this definition, are sort of categorized within competitors. Customers could buy from them instead, right? But they also customers can buy from complementers. Suppliers can supply to complementary products or services, right? And this value net sort of expand identification by emphasizing the role of complementers. We have complementers here. Complementers under P obviously is one of our 5 forces. Right? And what are complementers? Well, we're going to go in great detail what they mean, but they're the mirror image of competitors. Right? Basically, what they do is the presence of competitors makes what an organization provides less valuable to customers. But the presence of complementers makes what an organization provides more value to customers. The presence of competitors makes suppliers the opportunity cost of a supplier supplying the organization go up, right? Because the idea is that I have alternatives. I can supply somebody else instead. I can take my services elsewhere, right? But complementers on the supply side, right, make it more attractive to supply the organization, right? And so they're, again, mirror image of competitors, but they're also, both of them are defined with respect to both suppliers and customers, right? So competitors can compete for your customers, but they also compete for your suppliers. Complementers can complement you with respect to customers and also with respect to suppliers. I then gave an example. So these are slides that I presented previously. I gave the example of Dell computer. Right? When you think about Dell, they're being the focal organization, right? They would, of course, sell direct, so their customers are the end users. Lots of suppliers to Dell, but the key suppliers, the ones that are capturing most of the value, right, are Intel and Microsoft, who each have virtual monopolies in what they supply. I'm not talking about Microsoft as a software provider as much as an operating system provider, because the software, if you think about the application software, Microsoft Office, etc., sure, you could have it pre-installed, but it's something separate. Without an operating system, your machine is just an expensive doorstop, right? But competitors would be, other HP, Acer, Lenovo. Back in the 90s, when we've looked at Dell, you'd include also Compaq and IBM, Gateway. Now, what's a complementer to a Dell computer? Well, think about software. And I put Adobe Electronic Arts simply because they're sort of pure software players and they're pure application software players. They're not like Microsoft, which also produces operating systems. Right? But the idea is the value of what, and they're also not going to provide things that are likely to be pre-installed on your Dell computer. Right? The fact that you can, play games from Electronic Arts or use applications from Adobe, right, to create documents, that increases the value of that Dell computer, right? In that sense, so these are complementers to Dell. All right, and so that's just generally speaking what we mean by complementer. And let's talk about each of these specific answers. Right? Let's go through each one in detail. So A says, remember, we're trying to figure out, do these statements, which of the following statements would not imply that company A is a complement of company B? So we want to figure out, does each one imply that company A is a complement of company B? Well, so suppose customer 1 is to pay for company B's product increases when the customer also has company A's product. Right? So that, in other words, there's something special about having the two things together as opposed to having each alone. Right? And algebraically, what that is saying, what we're saying is that the willingness to pay for A plus B is greater than the willingness to pay for A alone without any B, right? Plus the value willingness to pay for B without A, right? So the implication here is again sort of the standalone value of A, the standalone value of B, and the combined value. The combined value is greater than just adding up the standalone values of the individual products. So let's see so does that or does that not imply that company A is a complement of company B? Well, let's look at what we said about that. Well, here's actually both your readings in this module talked about complements, but let's talk about, here's a brief, neither of them talked terribly comprehensively about them. I talked more in my slides than they did in the readings, but here is a discussion of a demand side, and we'll talk about what that means, a complement, from the 5 Competitive Forces reading by Michael Porter. Under the heading on complementary products and services, he wrote the following, quote, complements are products or services used together with an industry's product. Complements arise when the customer's benefit of two products combined is greater than the sum of each product's value in isolation. Computer hardware and software, for instance, are valuable together and worthless when separated. Right? If you had a game, a PlayStation game, but you had no PlayStation, the game would be worthless. If you had the PlayStation, but with no software whatsoever to run on it, or no games, the hardware would be worthless. But together the value is significant. So again, so specifically, right, to identify a demand-side complement, you just figure out which product or services increase the customer's willingness to pay for the organization's product or service. Those are the complements to the organization you're analyzing. Again, algebraically, we're saying A is a complement to B with respect to customers if the willingness to pay for A plus B together is greater than the willingness to pay of A plus willingness to pay of B. Right? This is excerpted exactly from a slide that I presented. I think I used X and Y instead of A and B, but still, to what it means to be a demand-side complement. Well, that's exactly what answer A is, right? The willingness to pay of A plus B is greater than the willingness to pay of A plus willingness to pay of B. So if A is true, if statement A is true, then company A is a complementer to company B. So A cannot be, therefore, is not the right answer here, because you're asked which, if any, of the statements below would not imply that company A is a complementer to company B. Well, this statement does imply that company A is a complementer to company B. All right. Well, let's look at answer B. The supplier cost of selling to company B increases when the supplier also sells its input to company A. So it's very similar to answer A, except that now we're talking about the cost of selling, right? It's from the supply side here. So we're talking about supply side complements. We'll get into that. Algebraically, what is this saying? Well, it's saying, again, for a supplier, the cost of selling to both A and B is greater than the cost for them just to sell to A plus the cost for them to sell to B, right? And so the idea is, think about this, is that, what would I be willing to sell my services, to teach for, say, NPS, right? That's the cost. That's the opportunity cost of supplying my services to NPS, right? What would be my opportunity cost of supplying to, the Cal State Monterey Bay, nearby, and so what would be if I was just going to teach there and research there, what would they have to pay me, right? As opposed to what they would have to pay me together, right? And the idea to actually do both, right? And so is it that doing one makes it easier for me to do the other, or it makes it harder for me to do the other, right? If it makes it harder, right, then this is what it's saying. It's saying the cost of doing both, right, is greater than the cost of just individually supplying to each. Now, let's think about examples we talked about. So now how do we dive? This is what we would call a supply-side complement. Right? But what is a supply-side complement? Well, I gave you this example of the F-22 Advanced Tactical Fighter. Right? It is the F-22 program complements and is complemented by other programs that share the same development activity. Right? So here's a quote from the former chairman and CEO of General Dynamics, quote, "As demand continues to fall in other defense programs served by the F-22 development team, a portion of the fixed and overhead costs formerly supported by those programs automatically shifts over to the F-22. The danger is that this model program could ultimately become unaffordable because of the growing overhead and fixed cost burdens." What he's saying is that, look, they quote the government a price to provide and develop the F-22. But that is based on them thinking about what their costs are to provide the F-22, assuming that some of the costs are covered by other programs because they share development tasks, share overhead, share knowledge, right? And therefore, the cost to each individual program is reduced because those certain aspects are shared across development programs. But if you eliminate one development program, right, then the fixed cost burdens all shift to whatever is left, raising the cost. And so what it means is that, therefore, if you kill one of the supply-side complements, you may, ultimately, to use a bad metaphor here, shoot down the F-22 as collateral damage, right? Because you're going to raise the cost of this program because now it becomes more costly. But it's cheaper if I can supply A and B. My cost of supplying each individual one is lower, right? So what could happen is in cutting defense programs it doesn't want, Congress could inadvertently endanger programs that it does want, right? Because of not recognizing the supply-side complementarity. So again, if you want to identify supply-side complements, you ask yourself the question, which products or services decrease the supplier opportunity cost to provide services or inputs to the organization. Right? And algebraically, we say that A is a complement to B with respect to suppliers if the cost of selling to both A and B is less than the cost of the sum of the individual costs. Right? So the idea is that it might be that to just do the F-22, all the fixed costs would be included here. To just do some other complementary program that uses some similar technologies, some either other fighter jet or maybe a weapon system, all the fixed costs would be included here in the cost of doing that B. But when you do them together, you're spreading the fixed costs, right? So the total cost of doing the two things together is less than the sum of the individual costs, or what it would be cost at a standalone. So the cost of selling A plus B is less than the cost of A plus the cost of B. Well, that's the opposite of what we said here. Here, if this is true, right? If the supplier cost of selling to company B increases when the supplier also sells its input to company A, that implies that company A is certainly not a complementor to company B, right? In some sense, it's actually a competitor with respect to suppliers, right? But it is certainly not a complementor to company B, right? And so that is, we're getting the hint that could very well be our answer, right? That this says that, this statement says that this statement B would not imply that company A is a complementor to company B, right? But we got to look at the other things too. In particular, let's look at answer C, which says that company B is a complementor to company A. Okay, so wait a minute. So it's saying which statement again would not imply that company A is a complementor to company B? So we're asking the question: if company B is a complementor to company A, does that also mean that company A is a complementor to company B? Right? Do we have a reflexive property here, and the answer is, think about this, right? Well, let's look at algebraically. Here's what we have for demand side complements, right? The one pay of A plus B is greater than the one pay of A plus the one pay for B. Right? Well, if you switch the A's and the B's in this equation, right? Yeah, if A is a demand side complement to B, then B is a demand side complement to A. And the same thing for supply side, right? We said this is actually, for it to have a supply side complementarity, the cost of selling A plus B must be less than the cost of A plus the cost of B. But if you switch to A's and B's, right, you get the same thing. So yeah, if A is a complement to B, then B has to be a complement to A, right? So answer C would imply that company A is a complementer to company B, right? So certainly answer C cannot be the right answer, because certain company B, answer C does not, right? Answer C does imply that company A is a complementor to company B, right? So that can't be your right answer. Answer D says, gives you the option that maybe all of them actually imply that company A is a complementor to company B, but no, only two of them do. So answer D can't be correct, right? And so the right answer is B. Right? This is the one statement that does not imply that company A is a complementor to company B, right? In fact, it applies the opposite. It implies that it's certainly not a complementor to company B. In fact, it's a competitor relative to its suppliers. So that was question 1 in that section. Again, this is one I think the average score. I think the answer. I think it's like 79% answered it correctly. So again, it's one of those ones where almost didn't make the cut for being included in this presentation. But better safe than sorry to at least clarify this. And so then the last question on the quiz that presented some problems was question 3 in the section on Beyond the Five Forces, right? And this question was. Well, let me read it to you first. Influence efforts related to the creation, modification, and/or preservation of external rules or restrictions governing the operations of a business or organization are referred to, at least in your required concept reading, as, what are they called? Influence efforts related to the creation, modification, and/or preservation of external rules and/or restrictions. Right? Influence efforts related to rules or restrictions. What do they call them in the reading? Right? Well, this, of course, required that you actually did the reading on Winning the Influence Game, or had it handy and therefore were able to look at it. I mean, there's only 19 questions on the quiz, so you should have had time to look back at this. But yeah, this question certainly was one of those "did you read it" sort of questions on the quiz. If you read it, you got it right. If you didn't read it, you might have a good chance you got it wrong, right? It wasn't even, but it didn't require you to have any deep understanding of it, just simply have read it. So here's some quotes from that Winning the Influence Game on these different influence efforts. One common goal of external influence efforts is to increase or preserve the company's bargaining power relative to other players in the value net. We term these efforts value net games. Right? Value net games concern the creation, modification, and preservation of contractual relationships among players in the value net, both business and non-business, that define how value will be created and claimed. Right? So basically, influence efforts, with, again, remember in the value net, it has customers, suppliers, competitors, complementers, anything influencing the bargaining power within that value net. Those are called value net games. Another common goal is to limit the impact of rules imposed by governments in the public interest, for example, concerning taxes and restrictions on conduct. We term these efforts public interest games. Public interest games concern the creation, modification, and preservation of rules governing the conduct of business, for example, tax laws and environmental regulations. Right? So one is to influence bargaining power among the players in the value net. That's called the value net game. And the other type of influence game is called a public interest game, and that's about how influencing the rules and regulations. So going back to the question, right? Answer A was value net games. Of course, no, that's not. that is about, who captures the pie. It's not about the rules and restrictions. We said that value net games are about bargaining power among the players in the value net. And the answer, of course, this is directly quoted. This is a public interest games. Right? That's exactly what it's called. Now, the other answers up there, for example, the title of the article is Winning the Influence Game, so I certainly put that in there as a little bit of a decoy. Diplomacy game, we talked about corporate diplomacy a lot. Interdependency game, I talk about interdependency a lot. Non-market, they talked a little about non-market, and classifying things as non-market players. So these are all words that were floating around there, right? So it made the question a little bit hard. But in the end, right, it's straight out of, there's no thinking involved, it's straight out of the reading. If you did the reading, or if you had the reading even, you should have gotten this answer correct. All right, so those are the 4 questions, right, for which there were difficulties on this quiz. I hope that answers questions for those who are curious and actually took the time to watch this video. And otherwise, we will, like I said, congratulations on doing very well, very good high scores overall on this quiz. I was very, very pleased. Thank you.